Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karina Van Vliet, CEO of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and on behalf of the entire team at CCWA, I want to warmly welcome you to today's special program on Germany after Angela Merkel, for a look at her legacy as Chancellor and a look at the historic leadership transition that Germany is about to experience after the federal elections, which will be taking place on September 26th. This program today is a special partnership between a number of organizations that CCWA has the pleasure of working with. It is part of an initiative called Wunderbar Together, which is a comprehensive and collaborative initiative funded by the German Federal Foreign Office and implemented by the Goethe Institute. Our partners today are the World Affairs Councils of America and the American Council on Germany, with support from Atlantic Brücke. Thank you so very much to all our partners. It's great to have you join us today and to be connecting with audiences across the United States and also back in Europe. Before I introduce our speakers, a few housekeeping notes. If you're active on social media, feel free to tweet at @CleWorldAffairs or post on Facebook using our hashtag CCWA. Today's program will be recorded as part of our Global Conversations podcast, and we will have that posted on our website later on. Our program will consist of a moderated conversation for about 40-45 minutes and include Q&A. For our CCWA audience, I just want to note that this is not our traditional formal Q&A format. In fact, please feel free to start asking your questions throughout the conversation, as our moderator will be weaving in relevant questions throughout his dialogue with the speaker. So, to ask your question, please be sure to use the Q&A box. That's one of the functions below on your Zoom screen. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box. We won't be monitoring that one. And please aim to keep your questions brief and actual questions so that our moderator can include as many questions as possible today. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker and our moderator. Stefan Kornelius has been editor of the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung since 2000. And a year ago, he added additional responsibilities, and he is now political editor for Süddeutsche Zeitung, which includes both foreign and domestic coverage. In his reporting career, he has covered Germany's Christian Democratic Party, CDU, the chancellorship of Helmut Kohl, and defense issues in Europe. From 1996 to 1999, he served as the paper's Washington correspondent. And most notable for our conversation today, since 2005, he has been a close observer of Chancellor Merkel through the prism of foreign policy. His biography of her, entitled Angela Merkel, the Chancellor and Her World, was published in 2013 and has been translated into 13 languages. Stefan Kornelius joins us from Munich. Welcome. Moderating the conversation is Stephen Sokol, president of the American Council on Germany. Steve was in Berlin from 1988 to 1990, and experiencing both the wall and the fall of the Berlin Wall, this historic experience sparked his lifelong involvement with Germany. And for our audience, Steve was the president and CEO of World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh from 2010 to 2015. And during that time, he served on the board of the World Affairs Councils of America. So he is indeed very committed to the mission of councils to inspire international engagement across the United States. With that, Steve, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, Karina, thank you so much. And I have to say, I absolutely love the music that you had as we were all watching the screen before we went live. It had me hopping and thinking about 99 Luftballon, right? 99 balloons. I am absolutely delighted to see you, to partner with you and with your colleagues at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs for today's event. And as you mentioned, this is part of a series of events, actually the very first in a series of events that are being organized by the World Affairs Councils of America as part of its Wunderbar Together 2021 Engage America series on Germany's election and the future of transatlantic relations. I'm especially pleased to welcome Stefan Kornelius. Stefan, it is wonderful to see you. Herzlich willkommen. My only regret is that we're not able to have this conversation in person.
Well, thank you for having me, and so good to see you again.
So let's dive right in. This is obviously a historic election. It marks the end of an era and has the potential to be the beginning of something very, very new. Certainly, all of the candidates for chancellor are talking about the future. We just saw that most recently on Sunday night when they met for their Triell, or the debate between the three Kanzlerkandidaten. But before we talk about them and about the election, I'd like to start by looking back a little bit and talking about Angela Merkel and her legacy. Stefan, you first met Angela Merkel in 1989 in East Berlin, when she was already active in politics, but not yet active in the Christian Democratic Union. She was the speaker of a party called the Democratic Awakening. And throughout your career, you sort of followed her from time to time. You were a correspondent in Bonn. You were covering the CDU. At the time, Angela Merkel was a minister in the cabinet of Helmut Kohl. And from what I understand, she served as an important source for some of your reporting. And later still, you had a front row seat to observe Merkel's rise to power to become the head of the CDU. And as a matter of fact, in 2013, you wrote an authorized biography that traced how this young woman from East Germany became the most powerful politician in Europe. So as you think back about those early interactions with her, starting in 1989, what stood out to you? What were some of the impressions that you had of her?
Well, honestly, the first time I met her in '89, and she was actually sitting behind her, sort of the entrance door of her little office of the Demokratische Aufbruch, just in Friedrichstraße in Berlin, you wouldn't have really taken note of her. And I honestly must say, I probably never did. She was typing away at her typical, well, ordinary old-fashioned typewriter, some press releases, and we then really got in touch in the early 90s when she became a junior minister in Helmut Kohl's unified cabinet. And well, you should never reveal your sources as a journalist, but as she was a member of the leadership board of the CDU, you pretty much had to talk to her. She, however, never stood out in a respect that you thought, well, she's too ambitious, or she's pressing forward, or she would have some broad sort of following a scheme which leads her to the position she now held for 16 years. She was rather remote. She was taken aback. She was more observing than steering things. And this changed in 2008 when the CDU was voted out of office. Helmut Kohl followed his legacy when he was engulfed in the party financing scandal, and she seized the opportunity. She sensed at that very moment she can take power when she cut the ties between the party and Kohl, and by that pretty much got away with all the old boys network. It was actually only boys at that time, which were trying to follow Helmut Kohl in his footsteps, most notably Wolfgang Schäuble at that time. So that was the moment she rose to the occasion. She again had a very good sense for timing in the year 2000 when she denied the opportunity to lead the party into the federal elections at that time. Well, she actually didn't have the opportunity, but she would have harmed herself endlessly if she would have claimed it as party leader at that point. So she handed that over to the CSU leader from Bavaria in 2001, and then she stood up again in 2000. She stood up again in 2002, and then she stood up again in 2005 and took the helm. You never really knew what could actually come out of all of this. This is the most surprising thing if you look backwards, if you look back and try to find the moment when you realized what kind of potential that woman had. She extremely well hit her gifts and her strengths. So only now, I think, probably it wasn't before she became Chancellor that we really saw the potential she brought with herself.
So let me sort of push you on that a little bit, because as one thinks back about the last 16 years, there is no doubt that Merkel deserves credit for managing very difficult situations, both at home and abroad, situations that could have become disasters. And so the question I think that many people are asking is what is her legacy? Because there were definitely some successes, but there were also some areas where she maybe didn't make as much progress as one might have expected.
Probably I fly into this question a very sort of high level altitude, and then we can dig into whatever details you want. But I think two things stand out, definitely. One is in this high-speed time we live in, it's quite a remarkable achievement to govern in a very stable and predictable way for 16 years. These were tumultuous years. You mentioned all these huge problems and catastrophes, near hits we saw in that time. And she stood firm. Germany really lived through 16 extremely stable and prosperous years. Most of Germans would never say that this had been sort of a burden to them this time. Most of the world's harms were kept away from the country. So her first duty to serve the German people was well fulfilled. One other major sort of very broad theme is, and I think that's probably her biggest achievement, if you look at the foreign policy standing of Germany, actually Germany's role as of today in Europe and in the world, this has changed significantly in 16 years. Germany has grown in importance, in strength, in power, economically, basically in its leadership in Europe. Such a situation of being singled out in Europe, of almost sort of a semi-hegemonial situation, never had occurred historically without putting Europe's balance in danger and actually threatening that very German strength, because traditionally the balancing game in Europe was always led against Germany, and the kind of distrust which came up when Germany rose to such strength was understandable and dangerous. Actually, it led to 2 world wars. And for that respect, I think the biggest achievement probably is that she amassed so much trust and so much confidence in her work and in the country that Germany's rise was a peaceful, actually well-accepted rise in Europe. The European now is mostly led or directed, or at least moderated by Germany, and it hasn't really brought up that much opposition against that situation.
I think there was actually a recent poll that just came out from the European Council on Foreign Relations that polled populations across Europe. And one of the conclusions that was drawn from it was that the rest of Europe will miss Merkel when she is no longer there. But of course, that wasn't always the case. I mean, I'm thinking specifically about the Eurozone crisis in 2015, when there was a great deal of criticism voiced against Germany and Angela Merkel in specific because of the austerity measures that were being introduced. Another controversial topic, of course, was the migration crisis, which also began to unfold in that year. And when the Chancellor said, "Wir schaffen das," or "we'll manage this," that was something that, I'd say a good number of people in Germany welcomed and said it was the responsible and right thing to do. But there was a lot of concern about having migrants come into Germany, and this actually fueled the rise of populist right-wing movements in Germany.
Right. Well, let me answer both issues in a typical Merkel fashion. The simple question would be, what would have been the alternative? And in terms of the Euro crisis, we were at a situation where the common currency of the European Union, or 16 countries, the euro, was actually in danger to fold. Whether the debt-ridden southern European countries, but also others like Ireland, really put the entire currency scheme into huge trouble, because it wasn't Germany or any others who asked for austerity. it were the financial markets who made a simple bet. They betted that this is not sustainable, that those countries could not refinance themselves with the help of the open and sort of market-driven system which we know and accepted. And at that point, there were two choices. There were one choice or two options. One option was either Germany steps in and takes over that debt, and by that shoulders all the burden of those debt-ridden countries, or the other option was to bring those economies up to speed again, or reform them in such a way that they at least could sustain themselves to some certain level. And in that choice, actually, Europe's economic credo, its basic belief in how the continent should be governed economically, was decided. The model A, let's take over all the debt and have it financed by the strongest of us, was definitely the one which paid tribute to the state-driven economy, to the French model, to the Italian model. But in the end, most likely wouldn't have seen the day or seen the evening watched from the financial markets. What I mean is, it was not convincing that Germany on its own could have shouldered all the burden. The other option, or the other solution, was definitely the German way, thinking that for if you indebt yourself, you really have to pay for it at one point. You really have to have an economic system which is sustainable, and which cannot simply live by the printing press for euro notes. So Merkel had to fight two wars in that point. One of all was about the economic system, which was decided in Europe, and the other one was about the survivability of the euro. And from her point of view, I think she has succeeded. And look at Greece now; it's a very well-functioning economy. Also Spain, others. So there's not that much to complain. On the refugee crisis, same question. What would have been the options? At that point, there were 10,000s, 100,000s of refugees from Syria, also from Afghanistan, other places, coming via Turkey to Europe. And they definitely didn't want to stop in Hungary or Montenegro or want to go to Italy. They wanted to come to Germany. Why? Because it was the most promising country in terms of support, economic help, in terms of the legal framework, which helped them gain asylum status. So there was a natural magnetic mechanism which you couldn't stop immediately on proper legal terms. She couldn't have sent those people back. You can't close the borders. It's simply impossible given the landlocked situation of Germany. You couldn't have flushed them back with a water cannon. You couldn't have shot at them. So the only thing Merkel did was two things. One, negotiating in a very fast way a treaty with Turkey to stop that flow, and that helped. It cost some money, at least sort of channeled it. The other one was to sort of keep open the promise Europe always gave to people, which is that this is a rule-driven society. It's an open society, and it cares for those in need in the world. Mm-hmm. The balance is extremely difficult to strike, and yes, it led to the rise of the right wing in Germany. Actually, a phenomenon which we've seen all over Europe, and probably would have happened in Germany anyway in that course. But it was one of those tough situations where you simply could not win.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning that Angela Merkel's response to the pandemic was very different to the response to the Eurozone crisis, in terms of just listening to what you were saying about Germany not necessarily being willing to cover the cost of the rest of Europe in the Eurozone crisis, and yet Germany recognizing in the pandemic how important it was that there be a European-wide response to the spread of COVID-19.
Indeed. I mean, again, what happened during the pandemic was one of those crucial moments where Europe was about to break, or actually to make it. And in the end, yes, procurement of vaccines, the distribution of vaccines, negotiating with the companies who provided them, was a painful and not truly successful moment. On the other hand, it paid off because the members stayed together. Imagine Germany would have bought, with its immense buying power, what was available on the market. This would have led all of the rest of Europe to rally against this country. And that, in a situation where Germany was leading the EU presidency, was negotiating a new budget, and was finalizing the Brexit deal. It was an extremely crucial moment. I think the deal was struck rightly. We lacked 3 to 4 weeks in the vaccination process. Right now, Europe has overtaken the US and has matched Britain, which other means had initially succeeded and went forward. But we can also quite openly discuss those means, whether they were that fair and sort of helpful to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, undoubtedly, historians will be debating the impact of the Merkel era for years to come. And I'm sure that one of the issues that they'll come back to is climate policy, particularly given that she served as Minister of the Environment earlier in her career. And of course, climate policy is one of the issues that we're seeing play out right now during the election, because her departure leaves a tremendous void, and each of the 3 candidates who are vying to take her place will have a very steep learning curve. And I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about each of her prospective successors, but maybe before we do that, what are some of the main issues that are driving voters in this election? What's top of mind?
Well, the polls are pretty clear on this. First of all, it's yes, climate. And you all know a little bit the German psyche. If there's an issue which is rising high, it's done thoroughly, and this is where we are. It's a bit of a fear-driven moment as well, and I think the summer has given us plenty of cause to actually be a bit more afraid of what's happening here. We had the devastating flooding here in Germany. You have your own experiences in the United States. It is not very promising, not very hopeful what the outlook. I think this is the primary issue right now. The other one is sort of the mirror image of what happens after Merkel. Can we imagine to fill that void? What's happening to the European Union? Can we sustain that kind of stability and prosperity? We do see that the party system is taking on an entirely new shape. This is not the Germany we knew half a year ago. So something is happening here, and we're all in a process of finding out what. It's a new momentum. Parties are getting less and less important. It's again about personalities. The center of society has almost unified, but I mean, the major 3 parties are actually not that different. I mean, they do have differences. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you do realize that the choice is not really that sharp. It's not that ideological. So this is the broad picture we're facing now. And in terms of differences in candidates, yes, well, if you dig into the party programs, you'll find you can talk endlessly about tax schemes and minimum wage and how much you want to spend for changing the system in the version of the climate issue, CO2 neutrality, and at which time getting changing the energy sources, by which time when we should sort of get out of the fossil-driven car business, 2030, 2035. This is what's being debated. In the end, there will be a 3-party coalition, most likely. There is an option. There's a couple of scenarios where we can think about 2 parties again, but yes, there will be most likely 3 parties, which means compromise. And in that, it'll be probably the most toughest challenge for the system which we face, because the parties now, especially in the last weeks of the campaign, really had to show off their differences in a much sharper way. And this is something that we'll have to take back immediately after election day if they start negotiating who should govern with whom. So will there be a minimum wage of 12 euros? Will there be a tax increase for the upper tax brackets? All these issues are actually not decided in this elections. They'll be decided in the negotiations right afterwards.
Well, and I think you've touched on a number of things that I'd like to unpack a little bit further. You know, earlier in our conversation, you talked about how important stability is to the German voter, and that 16 years of Angela Merkel provided stability, and that many voters are now looking for a continuation of that stability, but they don't necessarily know where to find it. There are three candidates for Chancellor, and I think it's important to remind our viewers that in Germany, the Chancellor is not elected directly, but rather through the parties. And so I find your comment really interesting, that parties are becoming less important and it's more about the personalities. And certainly we've seen how personality has really turned things around for one of the major catch-all parties. But let's talk a little bit about the three parties and where they are. They're the Christian Democrats, the same party as Angela Merkel, where Armin Laschet is the Chancellor candidate. There are the Social Democrats, where Olaf Scholz is the candidate for Chancellor. And then the Green Party, which really made a splash in the spring with their selection of Annalena Baerbock as a potential successor to Angela Merkel. And the three candidates have met in two debates so far. The second one took place just on Sunday evening. And as you talked about, many of these issues, taxes, a minimum wage, energy policy, the future were on the agenda when they met. Can you talk a little bit about each of these candidates and what they stand for?
Well, sure, happily. I mean, this is really an unusual election year. We've seen all shades and moments which you can envision in a campaign. It's been a roller coaster year for all parties, the three major ones, and we now really have to talk about three parties and not two parties. It's the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Christian Democrats. Starting with the Christian Democrats, they came pretty late into the process because they postponed the search for their prime candidate, for their candidate for the chancellorship. So even if people don't vote for it, they present someone who they want to vote in the office, and they postponed the decision who should be party chairman until 1st January, and then the candidate position was not decided until after Easter, and that really harmed the party because they never found common ground on the campaign issues, on the broad themes. The audience was not able to get acquainted with the candidates. The really harsh and brutal leadership battle between the CDU and the CSU, the Bavarian sister party, took a huge blood toll. So the party actually went crippled into that campaign and never recovered. That now chairman and main candidate, Armin Laschet, he's the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia. He's actually an old hand in the CDU. I met him first in 1994, also in Bonn, when he became a member of parliament, one of the rising young, well, I wouldn't say stars. He was, there were others who were taking the light, and he was just one of the youngest there. And he had a typical party career. He served his party, he got jobs, and somehow he got into office. And he is a not too charismatic personality. He's an extremely jovial and likable type. He's a typical Rhinelander. He's this guy who you want to go have a drink with. He's not confrontational. He's a compromise builder. He governs a coalition with just one vote majority in North Rhine-Westphalia. So he lacks the edges people probably wanted to see at that point. And he had an extremely bad start in the campaign when his homeland, North Rhine-Westphalia, was hit by the floodings. And he appeared in one of the flood areas together with the German president, and he stood behind the president during a press conference and had a quite amicable chat with somebody, sort of erupting in laughter and joy. And everyone was asking, well, why is he laughing at this moment? This is the most painful situation for him and his country, and he shouldn't be laughing. So that really hurt himself. He hurt him extremely badly. And so that continued, and it was only probably last Sunday, and you saw the debate, that he woke up, got more aggressive, turned out the heat, and really showed to his party that there's something to fight for. If you travel the country, you don't see campaign ads for the CDU. They're not present there on the streets. The door-to-door campaigning really hasn't started yet. So it's the party sort of seems like they want to get into opposition. They seem to be exhausted. And this showed in the polls, and they really tumbled from 30-something% to now roughly 20%, some say even 19%. This is devastating. If that's the way the CDU ends this campaign, that might cause serious implications to the cohesion of the party, to the leadership at all. I mean, they will be all swamped away. This is a landslide. This is the destruction of the CDU, of the Conservative Party, as we knew it. It's definitely not the catch-all party anymore. And this is what I mean when I say it has to be the right personality behind it. Laschet definitely wasn't the right personality. He wasn't chosen. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, before you go on to talk about the others a little bit, how do you explain this collapse within the CDU? I mean, you covered the Christian Democrats earlier in your career. Is it really just the lack of a charismatic candidate, or is there something deeper going on?
There are a couple of things going on. First of all, Merkel has pushed the CDU very, very much to the center of the German party spectrum. But not all of the CDU, especially now the younger ones, the East German ones, the Junge Union, which is the junior league sort of the CDU, are following her. They only followed her because she was in power, and she served them with jobs and with whatever the benefits of being in power are. But ideologically, they were not convinced. And now this kind of false unity is breaking apart. The other thing is, yes, the party is exhausted, and it's probably a pretty natural feature of democracy that parties should alter, that there is a time in opposition to recharge and to reinvigorate, to get new ideas, to bring up new people, new personnel. And the CDU and that election was designed to be the first one in post-war German history where the governing party would continue in office while changing the chancellor. And that's a first. So you changed the horse midstream. Probably that was too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about how you see things happening within the Social Democratic Party and for the Greens. I mean, it's almost a mirror image if you think about the Christian Democrats dropping from 35, 36% in the polls to now between 19 and 23% in the polls. Yeah. And the Social Democrats going from about 15% in the polls to 25 to 27% in the polls, despite the fact that the party has not really put together a program that is convincing voters. It's more that there's a leader or a potential chancellor candidate who seems to provide some of the stability that voters are looking for.
I mean, to understand the Social Democrats, probably I should lose a word on the Greens first, because that's the other roller coaster party in that campaign.
Yes.
With a extremely well orchestrated run up to that election year, with a party which found its balance, which has sort of put itself on a new platform, very centristic, very open to even conservative parts in the country, very modern, unideological, shedding away with all the burden they had on mostly security policy issues, Bundeswehr, out of area, military stuff. That was all history. Now they had that wonderful, shiny couple, dual leadership, Annalena Baerbock and Habeck, who was like a sort of the daughter and son-in-law you wish for. And then they had to make up their mind who should run. And that really put a knife in that couple, sort of in that picture. So that destroyed the picture of unity and cleanness and soberness, which they made up for all that year. And then came an extremely unlucky moment for Annalena Baerbock, who was chosen, or who actually pushed herself to the front seat. And at a moment where the Greens actually thought they could take that chancellorship, they could be the #1 party. And she took over. And then all of a sudden people realized, well, she's just 42. She's totally unexperienced. She's never governed anywhere. She hasn't even run an office. And she wasn't even able to keep her own books, meaning she was, or keep her own sort of details in order. She wrote a book and she copy-pasted, she plagiated from other sources. She was untruthful about her own resume. She was giving not the truth about sort of side incomes she had, all speaking against that kind of sort of that image of cleanness and purity, which they built up so carefully. So that really distracted the party in the course of 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and they have never recovered from it. Right now, she's actually doing a pretty good campaign. I met her last week. We did an interview with her, and she was extremely focused and well spoken. However, you do realize that she's under tremendous pressure, and she will not deliver as expected. So the Greens were right there at the zenith of their power. They were at the on the Olympus, Mount Olympus, and they could just grasp for power, and they lost it. Now comes in Olaf Scholz, the Social Democrats.
Before you go to Scholz, then has Annalena Baerbock given up the notion of becoming chancellor, and is it now really all about making sure that her party comes in at 18% of the vote rather than 11 or 12% of the vote, both of which would still be more than they currently have in the Bundestag, but to make them a stronger coalition partner in the negotiations that will take place after the election?
Yeah, she hasn't given up officially or publicly. She's never said, well, I don't expect to be chancellor anymore. She still talks about, as chancellor, I would, but they are realistic. They are not really pushing this anymore. It would be weird. They do have a pretty stable voter base of 17%. This is what they really can expect, and everything on top is icing on the cake now. So they go for the 19 or 20 even, but definitely anything higher seems to be out of reach. And that's still a tremendous success compared to 4 years ago. Nevertheless, it's a disappointment to where they were just half a year ago. But again, probably that was a smokescreen. That was just a facade. And we discovered that and destroyed the facade pretty quickly the moment the campaign started. Well, and that all benefited Olaf Scholz. The Social Democrats pretty much were that successful because they didn't do anything. I mean, they focused on their candidate. They knew they had the most trustworthy, the most experienced, the most sort of even boring candidate, and he developed that picture of sort of continuity and trust by even imitating Angela Merkel. And that was the most funny part in that campaign, when he sort of copied the famous Merkel triangle and really followed the campaign line, which is perfectly thought through. Don't rock the boat. Just take that picture to the front. Take this man to the front. He was the finance minister. He's a Hanseatic, he's a Hamburg guy who's calm, no unnecessary word. He knows the world, he can negotiate. He was in EU financial councils, he was in the White House. He's the guy you can trust, and he's the guy who would continue Merkel's path. And this is the SPD's message. And funny enough, all the questions you should have about the Social Democrats, who do you want to govern with? Who will be in your cabinet? What's your program actually? What about the finances? How about all these many Social Democrats who have far more leftish view than Scholz has? What will happen to all of that? These questions really have never materialized in a way that they would be dangerous to him. Yes, they're asked, they're talked about, people write about it, but nobody asked. He's not even forced to make a clear distinction between him and the Linkspartei, which then goes to the core of the German system, i.e., should we be a member of NATO, should there be nuclear deterrence, all these things. He's not forced to separate him from that toxic waste which waits for him. So it's a fascinating picture, but then again, the last weeks might shift everything again, or not, at least not a lot, but to some degree. People are now asking more substantial questions. The content of the campaign papers is being discussed. The debates are sharper. The polarization of the field becomes more visible.
So we've got a couple of questions that focus on foreign policy, and I'd like to get to those in just a minute, but I'd also like to invite our viewers, if you have a question, to submit it using the Q&A function. But before we sort of come to the foreign policy question, we need to talk about what a potential new governing coalition might look like. You had said earlier that it looks highly likely that there will be a three-party coalition, that a two-party coalition, as is the case right now, is highly unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And you talked about the tradition of compromise and building consensus in these coalition negotiations. Can you talk a little bit about which coalitions you think are the most likely, and the ones that are sort of the most preferred by the German public?
Well, there are roughly 7 coalition options which we can discuss, but the most likely ones are either led by the CDU or by the Social Democrats, and most likely will have the Greens and the Liberals, FDP, as coalition partners. So if you turn this around, you can argue, well, the FDP and the Greens are set. They will be in the government. They just have to pick the senior partner. And again, that could be both. Even if, let's say, the CDU comes in second, there's no rule, there's no law in German constitution, no provision that says the number one party has to send the chancellor in office. So it's all up to the negotiating process. Now, the big question is, what are the obstacles in bringing those three together, or the respective three together? The main issue are right now taxes, minimum wage, and the speed of ecological change, or CO2, carbon neutrality, electrification of mobility, all these issues. And the Greens definitely have one. They need to take away one big win from that election, and so their price will be, yes, we'll go in a coalition, but we will ask for a super ministry, for some super position, which will which will symbolize that historic change which we stand for, which is we are the party which leads Germany into carbon neutrality. They are probably not as firm in issues of tax rise and minimum wage, even though they have a much sharper social agenda than the Christian Democrats do. But in that respect, I think they're closer to the CDU and the Liberals than to the SPD. The SPD is much more committed to the social benefits and also to tax issues. The big question will be, who will pay for these huge costs, which are definitely on the horizon to pay for the carbon changes and the climate issue. And it's estimated there needs to be an investment of around 100 billion euros. Sounds small money to American audiences. It's not that small here, but the liberals in that picture do have the sort of the most important role, because they might be the ones sitting in the back seat, but actually deciding the speed of all of this. So their vote is needed, but they're most committed to not raising taxes and not turning Germany into a government spending monster. So we do have real differences. I can't tell you how that negotiating process will unfold. There are some unknowns, and I think we should talk about them briefly, because it's still not ruled out that the Social Democrats might have an eye on the Linkspartei, which is the old East German governing party, and which is extremely leftish, up to the point where, as I mentioned earlier, they still think we should leave NATO and get rid of nuclear deterrence and sort of be the peace nation of the world. And the Social Democrats haven't ruled out to take them into a coalition, which would be rather attractive for even a lot of Social Democrats of ranks and files. And one other unpredictable part is the fate of the CDU the minute we get the results. So if we really see that kind of slump we now expect, the knights will be out. The knives will be out. So probably Laschet will not survive the day. Probably the party voluntarily says, this is it, we go out. We have to sort out our own things. Just try and find your own government.
And one of our viewers asks, what about the far right? What about the Alternative for Germany?
That's the one thing which seems to be pretty clear. All other parties, all the parties we talked about until now, have ruled out either to talk or not to govern with them. So yes, they will catch a lot of votes. It's expected now roughly around 10%, 11 perhaps, which is still a lot smaller, a lot less than comparable parties all over Europe do have. So the right wing usually has around 15, 17, even 20% in some countries. So it is contained, but that kind of containment, that firewall is endangered the moment the CDU is forced into opposition. There are significant forces within the CDU who would argue it should be our task to embrace them, to bring them back into our camp, and to open up for at least parts of them.
So Stefan, your biography of Angela Merkel really sort of looked at her time in office through a foreign policy lens. And as we start to wrap up, I'd like to come back to foreign policy and fold in a couple of questions that we've gotten from some of our viewers. You've obviously said that it is unclear exactly what the new governing coalition will look like, but one of our viewers would like to know whether you anticipate any significant shifts in German foreign policy in the post-Merkel era. And specifically, she asks whether you think there will be more hawkishness against countries like China and Russia, in contrast to Merkel's relatively moderate influence, and whether or not foreign policy is a priority at all. In Sunday night's debate, foreign policy was not a factor at all. There were no questions on foreign policy. And so do you think there will be a change in German foreign policy in the next government?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The big disappointment of last debate was there was no world in it. I mean, this is unbelievable. I actually wrote our main opinion piece today exactly about the fact and how bad that is, especially since the parties are pretending that all these issues we're talking about now all the time can be solved solely domestically, and they can't. The entire climate issue is a European issue. You can't reduce carbon or you can't increase carbon taxes in Germany and don't expect all industry just going abroad and setting up tent, let's say, in neighboring countries because it's much cheaper. So it has to have a European solution. Will there be big changes? No. The beauty of the German system is the coalition system requires and forces parties to keep stability in those broad and very substantive issues like foreign policy. So being a member of NATO and the EU, being committed to the transatlantic alliance, the rough outlines versus Russia and China, they will stay the same. Now, a lot of people say, especially outside Germany, well, not this, doing the same is simply not enough. You have to do much more. And honestly, this is consensus in the political, or at least foreign political elite in this country. It simply isn't transformed into political action. It is always measured in terms of defense spending. I think this is the wrong measurement. Yes, it has to be increased significantly. But much more important, I think, is the willingness to take on risks, the willingness to find leverage versus opponents. Let's say those we can match as Germany, like Turkey, like others in our near environment. How to deal with those who break the rules in the EU, like Poland or Hungary. The kind of extremely tiptoeing way Merkel dealt with them fueled probably their perception that they can get away with it. And the preparedness of Germany to be tougher in some measures needs to increase. Now, what does that mean versus China and Russia? This might be a different league. China most likely. Russia, not necessarily. The provocations on the eastern borders of the European Union are significant. Belarus is sending refugees over the border fences simply to destabilize the Baltic countries or Poland. And those countries need our support, and they also need it militarily. Russia is just starting its Zapad maneuver, the biggest military exercise annually, and NATO is matching up now to it, but not enough. Speed, readiness, all these issues are not really on the level you expect for, and definitely Germany is not providing what it needs for. We talk Afghanistan, let's look at Mali. Germany has still 3,000 troops in Mali together with France. If there would be a situation as in Afghanistan, the need to evacuate, we would call the Pentagon for a lift. China is the big question. I mean, the Chinese perspective is totally different from seen from Washington or seen from Berlin versus Brussels. And I think before we first come up with a China strategy, we have to come up with a transatlantic strategy on who's right on this. I would give way on both sides. I think the China picture in the US is overstretched. Oh, you see the shades coming up, the Munich sundown. The kind of aggressiveness we do realize in tone seems to be overdone from here. But on the other side, the kind of European or German quietness versus all the disturbing things China is doing is also very much irritating. Since I do expect the Greens being in government and most likely taking over foreign policy, and Annalena Baerbock, the candidate, would most likely be the next foreign minister at that point, expect a much more moral approach to foreign policy, which doesn't necessarily need to be bad. It will be different.
Of course, thank you for that. And that actually anticipated one of the questions that one of our viewers had about who the likeliest candidate is for foreign minister. But of course, one of the sticking points in recent years, both under the Trump administration and to a lesser degree, but under the Biden administration, has been defense spending. And one of our viewers is curious whether an SPD-led government is certain to cut defense spending or not.
Well, they will not cut it, but they will definitely not significantly increase it. We talked about the 2% goal of NATO, which means 2% of GDP should be spent for defense. Germany is at 1.5, something like that. According to the financial projections, it will increase year by year. I think it's an appropriate plan, because if you first of all, measured by GDP is a very volatile thing. GDP can shrink, so how do you take it then? Then you have to find ways to spend it as well, and you have to spend it in Europe a little bit more, sort of having an eye to your neighbors. It doesn't make much sense if Germany gets armed up in a significant way and our neighbors not, which makes them extremely uneasy. Don't forget about that pattern. But yes, the Social Democrats will have extreme hard time finding the votes in parliament to put that through. Scholz is committed as a chancellor, but you now wonder how much of his capital can he spend on defense. He has so much to spend on. He has to keep the ranks and files together, and it isn't a given that he would first put all his money on the defense sector. If you just have a look on one of the most contested issues, which is having armed drones. Yes, sorry to tell you guys, but that's not a clear-cut issue in Germany, that we should buy armed drones to lead strikes against enemies. And the Social Democrats had successfully fended off procurement of that weapon for most of the last legislature. So defense will be a tough ride.
Thank you, Stefan. We are quickly coming to the end, and I'd like to ask you one more quick question, and that is with sort of less than 2 weeks until the election, what are the things that you are following closely as indicators of how the election might pan out?
Well, there always can be the bumps on the road. There's unknown unknowns. Those big mistakes or one of the candidates can take, but most importantly, it's now to watch the number of undecided. The longer it stretches, the longer people are undecided, the better it'll be for the CDU. The more people now decide on their vote and actually vote already, the poll is open, so we can send in votes for a couple of weeks already, the more it helps Olaf Scholz.
Well, Stefan, thank you so much for this incredibly timely discussion, looking back at Merkel's legacy, but also trying to parse what's going on in German politics. And Karina, I want to thank you and your colleagues at the Cleveland Council on World Affairs for hosting this event, which kicks off a series of events on the German election that are being put together by the World Affairs Councils of America.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. And Stefan, thank you so very much for joining us here in Cleveland, Ohio, and across the United States to give us a really nuanced and really detailed insight into what's going on at this very important moment in Germany. And as a token of our appreciation, we always send our guest speakers a small Cleveland in a box, which contains some small items from some local businesses here, and it will give you a taste of Cleveland. So it may take some while for our box to reach you in Munich, but rest assured that we'll be sending you our gratitude across the Atlantic. And Steve, I'm sure that'll be faster to you in New York, but thank you as well. This was a wonderful conversation. I think we'll all be really watching closely what goes on, and I think you've really laid out the stakes for what's going to happen on September 26th, and then after that with the coalition. To all of our partners, World Affairs Councils of America, American Council on Germany, Atlantic Brücke, Thank you for helping us bring this conversation to Cleveland as part of Wunderbar Together. And to our audience, thank you for attending. We hope you enjoyed the program, and we hope to see you participating in CCWA programs in the future.